Well, we have a constellation of star political writers with us today, and it's going to be a good roundtable discussion, even though we're not at a table, nor would it be round if we were. Shia Kapos is a national politics reporter for Politico. I'm doing this in alphabetical order. She writes the Illinois Playbook column. Quinn Myers is a reporter for Block Club Chicago. He covers City Hall and several neighborhoods. Alex Nitkin is the government finance and accountability reporter for the Illinois Answers Project, and that is published by the Better Government Association. Gregory Pratt is an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune who also covers City Hall, and he wrote the book on Mayor Lori Lightfoot's term in office, literally. And Laura Washington is a columnist for the Chicago Tribune and a regular political analyst for ABC7 Chicago. And I thank all of you for joining us for this discussion. Let's start with really the thing I think that people are thinking about right now, and that is momentum. If we'd held this roundtable discussion on the state of the presidential race a month ago, it would be a completely different discussion than we're having now. On Sunday, July 21st, Democratic President Joe Biden decided to end his bid for re-election and endorse Vice President Kamala Harris for president in his place. That has certainly shifted the focus of the race, but I guess the first question, and I'm not going to always throw questions to a particular person, but in this case, I'm going to just start with Laura Washington. To what degree has this really shifted the momentum?
I think it's completely shifted it. It's shifted it completely from Donald Trump to Kamala Harris. And the reason why is because Kamala Harris is the latest person in the race. She's the newly minted nominee. And I believe that a lot of the large part of this momentum was the pent-up first despair that Democrats had looking at Joe Biden as the possible or likely nominee that shifted when she got into the race, because I think people had already given up the ghost for the Democratic Party to win the White House, much less Congress, in November. When Biden got out, she was a new face, a fresh face, but people knew who she was. She was the vice president. Biden anointed her, and that turned the whole thing around.
But Quinn, yeah, I mean, is this kind of excitement sustainable?
Well, we'll see. I haven't seen a better 3 weeks in the campaign, maybe ever. The positive media coverage has been wall to wall. Meanwhile, Trump has had a couple, some would say, stumbles, including some comments made here in Chicago about Kamala Harris. He doesn't seem to be totally sure how to attack her. So I do think it's been an incredible month for the Democratic Party, but I do think reality will set in, especially as we start seeing Kamala Harris hopefully give more media interviews. She has not given any interviews since becoming the Democratic frontrunner here.
Greg Pratt.
Well, one of the interesting comments that former Republican challenger to Trump, Nikki Haley, made was that the first party to drop their near octogenarian from the ticket was going to be the party that wins. And I think that is an energy that you sort of see. Obviously, the election isn't over. There's a lot that can happen. But I think it's a really astute comment about where the dynamics are, where the country was unsatisfied with these two people. Now they've got something new to look at.
Yeah, Shia?
Well, and you look at the age was such a big issue when it was Biden versus Trump. And suddenly you look at Trump and Harris and you think, oh, wow, he's the older guy. Like, you didn't really notice it before, and suddenly age is taken a different shift, I think. And that goes to what Nikki Haley said, I think, and to what Laura said too. Democrats were just excited to root for somebody, and they finally have somebody new to root for.
Yeah, but Alex, when those of us who were in Milwaukee saw a kind of excitement, and admittedly the Republican convention happened right after the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, but the excitement level there was high, almost a fervor level. Do we discount that?
I think that they are probably feeling very different now than they did back then. Like you said, it was a completely different world. It was an 180-degree sort of difference. They were feeling this air of inevitability, like Trump was going to be president and they just needed to know by how much. And there was this sense of dread on the other side of it, of there were these, festering questions of, is President Biden actually going to be able to stay in the race? And I remember actually there were advocates for him dropping out at the time. One I keep thinking about of James Carville, the great, Democratic strategist commentator, saying like, we're going to be sitting Shiva in Chicago for 4 days. It's going to be brutal. It's going to be a dirge, which of course is a reason why Republicans were so, excited in the first place. But now it really seems like there is so much energy on the Democratic side. And if anything, it makes me a little concerned that there will not be very much incentive for the Harris campaign to give interviews or to come out with policy, because they're seeing this, if you want to call it that, momentum, their polling position get better. It's sort of like, why should we change anything? Why should we get in the way of that?
Oh, I think they're going to have to do policy. They're going to have
Eventually,
to do interviews. First of all, because the Trump campaign is going to really hit them hard and keep hitting them until they do it. Secondly, if this is not going to be about the base. You want the base to be energized. Harris wants her people to get out, but you're going to have to worry about those swing voters. And they want to see some substance. They want to see some issues. They're uncertain, and it's not just about Biden being too old. It's about them being uncertain about whether this is the candidate, this is the party that they want to go with. So they're going to have to lay it out and put some really strong policies on the table. The thing that fascinated me about that whole dynamic when it changed over was that the Trump campaign was so unprepared for it. Now, we didn't know what Biden was going to do, but the pressure had been building all the way up to the day he dropped out. And it became clearer and clearer that he wasn't going to be able to stay in. And in the meantime, I think the Trump people, including Donald Trump, who to this day is still saying, well, what about Biden? Whatever happened to Biden? He can't get over the fact that Biden's not in the race. So they were completely unprepared. They had no strategy. They had no talking points. They weren't able to pivot. And as it was said earlier, they still haven't pivoted. They're still scrambling around trying to find issues and talking points and strategies that are going to work against Kamala Harris.
And understand how to compete against a woman, black candidate. I think he hasn't figured out how to talk about her, how to talk to her. That debate in September is going to be really interesting.
Are you suggesting that it's a bad idea for Trump to campaign on a platform of the black lady is not a black lady?
Yeah.
It's not working for him
Well,
so far.
Yeah.
I do think, this is still truly a toss-up race, and I think there is all this excitement, especially in liberal circles, especially from all the media coverage, but Trump could very well still be elected. So I think, we'll see after maybe the things will die down after the convention next week, although maybe they won't. Maybe the Kamala wave will continue.
Yeah, I mean, I think underestimating Donald Trump is how he got into office in 2016. There are still people who are, in their minds, afraid of what would happen if Democratic rule continued in Washington. You could feel that in Milwaukee with the Republicans. They had a palpable fear that their lifestyle would not be what they want it to be.
You could say the same for the other side as well.
Right.
I mean, Biden's big point was we could see the end of democracy if Trump is reelected. But the other interesting dynamic is that it seems like it's sort of flipped in terms of where the fear factor is. Trump was the scary guy who was going to end democracy, who was a criminal, all this kind of stuff. Now, up against Kamala Harris, you're seeing more of a weaker Trump. He's not looking as big and scary as he did when he was up against Joe Biden. And I think that partly that's because Kamala Harris has so much momentum and because she's changed her messaging. She's not talking about the end of democracy, the world's going to end. She's talking about this guy's weird, this campaign is
It's
weird.
a little bit more nuanced, right, to
Right.
make it relatable to regular people who don't understand what doom and gloom. Does it really matter who the president is? But if you're talking about weird, that's a word we sort of get.
Well, both political parties have things that they can talk about that affect normal people and they speak to people's concerns about it. And one of the interesting things about Trump that has been really would concern me if I was his strategist is they gave him a 3,000-word speech for the RNC. He delivered a 12,000-word speech. He should be running the Joe Biden 2020 campaign of say a few things, speak to some issues, don't do anything crazy and stay in your basement. And he'd be better off than coming out and reminding people about some of the chaos and uncertainty, like the comments about Kamala Harris, which don't really do anything for anyone. I don't know who that is, who he's speaking to other than his own id.
Well, his visit to Chicago is a perfect example of that, too. He must have known he would get questions about how he has spoken and treated black people. So he should have been prepared. I thought the question did come out really strong initially. And
You're talking about the NABJ.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
NABJ
convention.
conference. And he could have finessed it a little bit at the beginning. Instead, he
Well,
dug right back in. It
And
was,
I'm going to want to move on to something else, but I sincerely believe he gave exactly the answer that he wanted to give. I mean, I think he wanted to push back hard, at least on that, and not answer the question that he was asked, which
He was speaking to his base. Correct?
Yes.
He wasn't speaking to the black journalists in the room.
right.
that's true.
But let's start talking about some of the issues in the race, because if there was any complaint, I think that I personally had after the debate between the former president and the current president, it was that if you had only seen the news coverage of that event, you would have no idea what either man had said about any issue, because the only coverage was Biden not being able to handle things. You wouldn't even know what Trump said about any issue. So let's start talking about some of the issues. And the big one for Republicans and Democrats in different directions, immigration. I mean, Donald Trump and Republicans attack Kamala Harris as the designated border czar, and the GOP attacks running mate Tim Walz for last year signing legislation that opens state services and benefits to undocumented immigrants. And they call those examples of the Harris-Walz campaign radical left. Is that a good path for them?
I think on
Quinn?
the base level, yes. I think it's important to note that Kamala Harris was never an official border czar. She wasn't charged with looking at the root causes of migration in South and Central American countries, but it could be an effective talking point. I do think President Biden's decision to strictly limit asylum seeking in June, I can't believe it was only 2 months ago, did have a big impact. In Chicago, we haven't seen a bus of migrants arrive here in, I believe, almost 2 months.
Right.
So I do think that kind of shifted the narrative, whereas before Trump was making pretty easy comments about open borders and how they're just coming to cities, et cetera. But I do think that will remain an effective tactic for Trump. Whether Harris can counter that, it kind of remains to be seen. We haven't seen any specifics on what she would do immigration-wise in her policy platform.
Their Democrats seem to be saying, look, we had a bipartisan deal, and Trump waded into it and scared Republicans off of it, so the deal never happened, and that immigration could have been solved a little bit earlier before Biden got involved, but Trump got involved. So that'll be the talking point, I think, of Democrats.
Alex?
What's interesting is that it seems like Democrats have really seized upon that. And if anything, Kamala Harris, one of her first, if not only, issue-based ads that has come out has been on that specific topic and saying Kamala Harris is going to secure our border. And it's interesting. It's a reflection of you're seeing just this very different sort of political climate than existed even 4 years ago, where it seems like the country, and even by extension sort of the center of the Democratic Party, is more immigration skeptical, immigration hostile, whatever you want to call it. But it seems like the more mainstream sort of take that the Harris campaign is running toward is one of, strong borders and limiting immigration. And they're really trying to own that topic, including with that, the fallout from that failed bill, and now with this ad.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people are still seeing, at least in big cities like Chicago, immigrants on the streets. If you're in the downtown area, you'll see every street corner as somebody selling candy. And there is that fear, at least in some of the disinvested neighborhoods, that somehow the resources that might have gone to those neighborhoods are now going to migrants. And so that's, I think that's a vulnerability for the Democrats.
Well, one of the few, when Trump came to NABJ, he had one specific strategy in mind, which is pit black people against migrants. He was a talking point he kept turning back to, which is a real dynamic that you see in the city of Chicago and in other places where you have people who have been here for a while, and disinvested areas and poorer areas who have some resentments about some of this, and he's been trying to stoke that, except it's pretty transparent, and so it hasn't necessarily been received as well. But that's something that he's stoking, and Harris is trying to counter it by saying he blew up the deal that would fix this problem, but we're closing down the border anyway. And she's a border state senator. She was a border state senator in California. She is much better equipped to talk about that than Joe Biden was.
I think that stoking those fears, though, is not just African American versus Latino, or the immigrants from South and Latin America and African Americans. Also, immigrant families or historically immigrant families who here in Chicago who have resentments about, we're not that much better off than the migrants that they're accepting. So I think that tension was there
Very
long
true.
before these Greg Abbott and company started sending these folks here. But I think that in terms of policy, I think long term she's also going to have to be able to address not only closing the border, but what do we do with the folks that are already here who aren't here legally, who technically can't get work, who are sitting on the street selling candy. We're going to have to find a way to adjust the policy and laws to address that, because I think there's a really compelling argument to make, and maybe this should be part of our argument, that these people are valuable to us. We need good workers. We need people who can work in the restaurants, work in the stores, and take and fill these jobs and contribute to the tax base. But in order to do that, we have to get them legalized and get them into the system.
And at the Republican convention, you had Donald Trump, what the placards were saying, mass deportation. I mean, there are stories out about how mass deportation, deporting people would cause inflation in a whole different way. It would hurt the economy in a whole different way.
Yeah, and that's never a winner because it's such a everybody knows somebody who immigrated here, who they like, who they respect, who they appreciate, and so even people that have issues with the border, concerns about this, don't like the sound of mass deportation. We're going to get rid of millions and millions of people because it sounds ominous. It's
Yeah, what are you going to do, knock on doors? I mean, it
Yeah.
sounds terrible.
But certain
Negative
Trump
doesn't-
surrogates have talked explicitly about doing that very thing. Whether logistically that could even be possible is another question.
Yeah.
But I do think that kind of the larger, there's been so much media coverage on the migrant crisis, the so-called migrant crisis. We haven't talked a lot about the dreamers, people who have been here and seeking, seeking a life here for, their whole lives potentially if they came here with their parents. I think Donald Trump has not made any promises about protections for that population, whereas Democrats in theory have. So it will be interesting to see if any of that plays out in this election, especially as more and more Latino people do seem to be kind of voting for Trump or supporting him.
Yeah, I think we can look toward that issue and others that are probably not being outlined as specifically as I think voters might want to see, or assuming they want to see details in these policies. But what we're getting now, it seems, are outlines, and is that not a problem? For example, economics. Both candidates say that they are going to preside over a strong economy. What do you do when that's as far as as it goes? Alex?
I think
Alex Nicken.
one of the really interesting things that no one is talking about is that something like half of the U.S. tax code is basically going to expire next year and have to be rewritten. There is so much, meaty, juicy economic policy discussion that is going to have to happen, mostly related to taxation at the federal level, but also how spending is going to be prioritized. I mean, if we're talking about what kinds of impact the next president or who's in Congress is going to have on the city of Chicago, I mean, it's going to be like money, money, and money. Those are there's so much federal money that filters down into the city and county budgets. And it's going to be so important to see what gets funded, what gets prioritized. It has implications for everything from public safety and what the police department is getting to do, to transit and housing. We saw an interesting, housing proposal come out from the White House today. So those are the things that I'm going to be watching. And at this point, we're still miles away from that.
Yeah. What specifics have we seen that are enough for people to latch on to. I
No
mean,
taxes on tips. They both like that.
exactly. And it's just a matter of who said it first.
That's a big one. I mean, Trump has talked about getting rid of certain taxes on Social Security for seniors is one that analysts say would add a lot to the national debt. Harris has really been pretty vague. I do believe she is going to give an economic address or kind of give some more specifics as soon as this week. But it's interesting that Tim Walz has been criticized for the free breakfast program in Minnesota, but it seems like Trump, with his potential tax cuts, is, as one analyst put it, giving out a lot of free lunch here. It does seem like we could see a lot of cuts, including on the tax cuts, including on the corporate side of things as well.
Interesting story out within the last week. In a new poll, voters said that they believe that they would be in better financial shape under former President Donald Trump than Vice President Kamala Harris, and that was by a 9-point margin. But at the same time, in the same poll, a slight majority said they have more faith in Kamala Harris to shepherd the U.S. economy. About 42% of the registered voters felt they'd be much better or somewhat better off if Trump wins, while 33% said the same about Harris. So we've got, even within one poll, same group of people going in different directions. What is anyone to make of that?
Is it your stock portfolio? So rich people think their stock portfolio will be better, but the bigger economy might be better under Harris?
I think people also overestimate how much effect the president has on the economy, unfortunately, and there's so much, the term is, I guess, negative partisanship, or whenever people's view of the economy tends to be so closely tied to who is president right now. And there's a lot of, I think, disconnect there.
Yeah, I
But
think
if you-
saw a comment from J.D. Vance today, or from someone in the Trump camp saying, well, if the economy can be fixed, why isn't Kamala Harris fixing it? She's in charge now. Now, of course, she's not in charge. She's a vice president. But that goes to your point. There's this perception that you can fix, that a president or even a vice president can wave a magic wand and fix things. And in fact, I think that the Harris campaign needs to hit harder and harder on this. Inflation is coming down. Things are getting better. But the problem is, as you'll see from the polls, that people are not feeling that. They're feeling like they're talking about, high prices in gas, high prices in groceries. So she's got to figure out a way to change her messaging to make people feel that.
Plus, you have Donald Trump saying he wants to control the Fed. I mean, that's a whole.
But do everyday people understand how the Fed works, except to hear that they know that if the Fed says something, then inflation's going to go up or interest rates are going to go up. And I'm not sure people kind of get what control of the Fed would do for them.
No, and that's not something that most people understand, or care about, even if it does impact them. They're more concerned about bread and butter issues, which Kamala Harris needs to go out and talk about in terms of, Trump has an advantage. Trump has an advantage on that issue right now, but she needs to go out there and talk about some of these policies that they have and that they want to propose that are popular. Like, I'm sure they'll be talking about earned income tax credit and things like that, family tax credits. And they will at some point, because they can't cede that ground to the Republicans and to Trump. It is amazing the way policy gets made on this campaign, where Trump is in Nevada and then he just randomly throws out a comment about, hey, maybe we shouldn't tax tips, and all of a sudden they're falling over themselves on an issue that I'd never heard of up until recently. But we're going to see some goofiness this campaign cycle.
That's for sure. And I mean, and don't forget the one thing that we have heard from Kamala Harris is raise the minimum wage. That's
like the absolute lowest hanging fruit, to raise the federal minimum wage, because like a decade ago, a lot of activists and labor in the party was saying raise the U.S. minimum wage to $15 an hour. Now raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour is like much less of an ask. And so right now, I think federally it's still $7
and 25 cents.
$7.25.
Wow.
So those are the sort of like, I think, low-hanging fruit things that you can do. And definitely, I think we should expect her to talk more about Greg, you mentioned the child tax credit that was part of, I think, the reconciliation package passed by the Democratic Congress, then expired after a year, that just cut child poverty in half overnight and then expired, again, that's probably not a very controversial economic policy I would expect her to bring back up.
Let's turn to another headline issue that people care about: crime. The Trump campaign accuses former California Attorney General Kamala Harris of releasing dangerous criminals back onto the streets and being in favor of sanctuary cities and defunding the police. But Trump himself has courted the African American vote by promoting second chance efforts for those who have been incarcerated. Again, the messages seem to be coming from different directions, but is anybody delivering a coherent message except that one side wants to protect ownership of guns and the other side wants to severely limit it?
Well, I don't think it's quite that stark,
Yeah.
though, because of Tim Walz, the vice presidential nominee to be, or already nominee, is, you know, he's a hunter, he's a gun owner, he's very prominent and proud of that. He's proud of the fact that he once had his NRA rating has changed over time because of that, and I think that helps leaven the Democrats and Harris's position on guns. The argument I think they're going to make is that, you know, we want to ensure safety. We want to ensure that people are safe from illegal use of guns. We want to make sure the guns are kept out of the hands of the wrong people. And that, I think, is a compelling argument that they can make.
But there's really been no talk about, you know, curbing crime. And, you know, in the past few years, we've seen several waves of tough on crime and then kind of backing off of it. I don't think I've seen any policies that really look at, you know, cities like Chicago, big cities that are dealing with crime waves, robberies, et cetera. That there's been loose talk on, broad talk on gun control, but how that will actually trickle down to a city like Chicago is still pretty unclear.
Plus, crime is dropping in Chicago, which makes it a more difficult talking point, I think.
Crime, like the economy, is a highly personal thing for people, and they don't, you know, how they feel about it doesn't necessarily track with statistics.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. In fact, those two issues are very much alike. People don't feel safe, and you tell them crime is dropping, but they hear the headlines. You know, how many young people in Chicago were shot and killed over the weekend? This weekend,
There's a body count every weekend,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
that dominates the headlines, and that's all
Yes.
people see and hear.
but when you have a police superintendent saying, well, no one actually died on the weekend, but one person succumbed to their wounds, and you're still, how many people were shot? We are not hearing the solid policies, I think. And what can they say? I mean, the gun issue seems to be where some of this has to go, but it seems like both sides are afraid to really grapple with it.
Well, you know, on crime and on guns, but specifically on crimes, they're interlinked. You know, young people really care about school shootings. They care about gun violence because they've lived an entire existence of every few months, some whack job gets a big gun and shoots a whole bunch of people for no reason, and the government doesn't do anything about it, and they get upset. And young people really feel that acutely in a way that other generations don't. And that's going to be a recurring issue that's a problem for Republicans and something that Kamala Harris will probably be talking about in terms of certain types of weapons being an issue. But in general, they're not talking a ton about crime. And it's interesting. They're trying to go after Walz over the George Floyd protests. But, you know, we've seen locally and we've seen nationally that the defund the police argument doesn't kill candidates the way that they thought it would. You know, they made that argument against Brandon Johnson in Chicago, and he was able to win. They made that argument. They're making that argument against Tim Walz and Kamala Harris. And so I think people aren't looking for slogans. They're looking for something more substantive.
Partially because none of these people ever actually have defunded police departments.
Yeah.
Even if it was a slogan like, this mayor in Chicago has increased the police, budget and probably will again, and so did, Harris in whatever capacity and Walz.
Yeah, I mean, it seems as if people didn't really mean defund the police. What people meant was take some of the money that is maybe being spent on police and putting it in mental health. And when you frame the argument that way, I think you get more acceptance from people. Quinn?
I was just going to say we have seen some backlash against the DAs and the top prosecutors around the country. The recent state's attorney's election here was in some ways a referendum on crime here. It'll be interesting to see if that trickles upwards. Although I do think the two candidates in the Democratic primary were actually not too dissimilar. They had to draw some lines there to appeal to voters. But
For Cook County State's
for Cook County State's attorney. But you would the candidate who was very simply labeled the tough on crime candidate did win that election.
Well, the only thing I would point out to that, because you're right, but even the so-called tough on crime DA candidate in her county state's attorney candidate, in her TV ad, she was talking about restorative justice, which is how far the pendulum has swung, where even the tough candidate is talking about not tough stuff.
Right,
Using
and,
those progressive terms that,
Yeah, I mean, even Trump passed legislation when he was in office, as I think you mentioned, a second chance legislation. So it is part of the conversation on both sides of the aisle.
Let's also talk about one of the other issues of, on day one are people ready to handle whatever crisis? Do you think that's going to be an issue in this campaign? Is Donald Trump ready? Is Kamala Harris ready?
Well, I would say on paper and actually in experience, particularly with Donald Trump, of course. I mean, he's been the president. He's served one term already. Kamala Harris has been in the White House. She's been a vice president. I think it's interesting that when Trump was asked that question during the National Association of Black Journalists Conference, did he think that J.D. Vance would be ready on day one because he is going to be the vice president?
yeah.
And he declined to answer that question. And then Vance was asked about it later, I think on ABC, and he said, well, the vice president doesn't matter. That's their current line. The vice president doesn't really matter. The president is one that matters. If I'll be there to support the president. So that they seem to be shy, at least on the Republican side. They seem to be shying away from that answer, partly because of all the controversy that's followed J.D. Vance since he was nominated.
Shia Kapos.
I've watched all the speeches that both Harris and Walz have given, and Walz every time talks about how Donald Trump froze during COVID. And I am waiting for that to become a bigger talking point, because you take that to be that he failed during, managing COVID. So I presume, to your point, that how he managed will be focused on COVID, and maybe that was a failure.
Although I do think no one wants to talk about COVID anymore. I think
Yeah,
everyone
isn't it
is
wild?
very
Yeah.
scarred from that experience, personally and politically. So I don't know how effective that tactic could be, although it could be a line of attack saying he totally bungled the COVID crisis.
Although he would be the first he's the first and the second to say that the development of the vaccine did come
Right.
on
He took
his
credit,
watch.
yeah.
To go back,
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
To go back to your original question about whether it's going to matter to voters, I mean, obviously it's very important. This is the most powerful person in the world who is going to be elected. It matters how maybe it's the most important thing, how they, handle a crisis. But I don't think that voters seem to really care or gravitate toward that much, unfortunately. I was just going back and recently watching a 2008 debate between Barack Obama and John McCain. And John McCain's stump speech line was, there's no time for on-the-job training. You're not ready. You're not seasoned enough, which is a lot of also what we heard from Hillary Clinton in 2016. Like, I'm more qualified than you are. I think that voters tend to go for what is more new and exciting, unfortunately, and not just who is the more responsible or cool and unflappable in a
And you have
crisis.
Trump telling Elon Musk that Harris couldn't handle dealing with all these world leaders, that she's not tough enough, that only he could.
Yeah, but I would say that Biden, the way Biden was perceived in the last few months is an exception. Even though Biden had already served one term as president, I think there was a lot of fear out there because of his age, because he seemed to be infirm, because he seemed to be not prepared, not able to communicate well in that disastrous debate, that people were worried. We can't have this guy here for 4 more years. He's not going to be able to step up and be there on day one, or much less 4 years from now. So I think in his case, there was a lot of concern, I think, out there among voters, and that's one of the things that did him in.
Well, President Biden at that debate looked like somebody you would not send down the street to get a gallon of milk at the grocery store. and it was his undoing. It was a tremendously bad performance. Harris is trying not to look stupid at any point, not to look unprepared, not to look unready. So that's why they're protecting her image. If I was Trump, I'd be concerned. If I was Trump's advisors, is he going to look like a rambling old guy at the turkey table, getting angry and talking about how back in his day you got 10 nickels for a quarter
Turkey
or whatever.
table.
Well, that's the thing. It's like what you said, Craig, earlier, is that no one remembered anything about that debate except that Biden fell apart when in fact, Trump didn't do a really great job either, and he was kind of out of it in his usual Trump self, kind of just disconnected, making all kinds of claims. And that's what he did in the last election campaign. And so the question is, will Trump in this debate, but Kamala Harris just simply have to stand by and let Trump be Trump and let him destroy himself.
Well, let me address the elephant in the room question, and that is, how much or what role do you all think race is going to play in this campaign in the next couple of months? I mean, is it going to not be talked about?
I think gender's the bigger thing personally, but we can talk about race.
Well, we
I
can
think they're
talk
both.
about.
I think they're both.
It's
Yeah,
already
we
being
can
talked
talk
about. Look at
about
Trump's
both.
comments at
Yeah.
NABJ.
Yeah.
I mean, that,
Right,
that was a
exactly.
pretty explicit
It
comment.
may not
so-
matter in the way that he wants it to matter, of basically just being surprised that a biracial person can possibly exist. But I don't know. I mean, I think that we've already seen the vice president make a lot of inroads among black voters and sort of maybe taking steps toward rebuilding that Obama coalition of voters. I think that she has been pretty careful about not really talking about race or gender that much on the campaign trail. But again, she hasn't talked a whole lot about anything specific yet.
Well, she doesn't have to talk about it because
Yeah.
Exactly,
it's
yeah.
clear, it's there, it's in front of your face
Right.
when you
That's
see
right.
her.
Right.
And I think the gender issue, I think you're right, Shia. There's already, Trump always mistreats women, and women politicians have talked to Nikki Haley about how he feels and acts around women politicians. So you're going to see some of that sexism and misogyny come through on the campaign trail because it's just who he is. And J.D. Vance has even said some, we know what he said about women. So I think it's going to, I think both issues are going to be on the table.
Yeah, Quinn, have you seen any indication that anyone is willing to explicitly deal with, besides Trump's own, she's I didn't know she was black statement, or is it one of those things that we still aren't willing to have the difficult discussions that race engenders?
Certainly, I think that's definitely a big part of it, and I think your point that she doesn't really want to talk about it. Maybe I think she wants to kind of be the anti-Trump, but not necessarily the Kamala Harris. I think it is definitely there, and I think we will see more of it coming. I don't know how that will manifest. Will that be in coded attack ads from the Trump campaign? Will that be in opinion polls? I'm not so sure, but yeah, certainly I think it does feel different though to me than the conversation when Barack Obama was running for office. That was a little bit before my time as a professional journalist, but and I'm sure you could all speak to it too. But I do think the conversation has shifted where it doesn't seem to be quite at the forefront as it was in that election.
But now you have white men for Kamala. I mean, who would have thought we would see this big
It's
group
marketing
of,
genius.
White
in a way,
dudes.
yeah.
Yeah, just all these different groups coming out and embracing, their whatever. And
I'm waiting for left-handers for Kamala. Mismatched soccers from Kamala. It's just the race question. It is we've already seen at a high level a black candidate, a woman candidate. Hillary got more votes than Trump, which we forget sometimes. And Hillary had a thing where she had 24 years of bad blood with certain voters and population. Kamala's new, so she has that to Alex's point, freshness and excitement and the newness that people go to. Where I just these issues aren't race and gender aren't necessarily talked about as much, but I don't think it's to Trump's benefit to wade in on that, which is of course not going to stop him.
Indeed, and in some ways, you can't help but wade into it on one of the issues that is in this race, and that is reproductive rights, because that was a big issue the last time. It's still an issue. I'm not sure it's the same this time. I mean, Shia,
Well,
what do you?
those are the voters, those Republican, probably women voters who might not be sure what to think about Trump, who are support abortion rights, who support reproductive rights. To hear him make comments about gender the way he does, that I could see that turning those voters off. And those are the people that he wants to keep in the Republican Party. So I think it is a mistake on his part to start using the gender card, because I think there are Republican women on the bubble who he could bring into the fold.
But is it smart, or should Democrats make an assumption that the reproductive rights issue is all theirs, and that it is? I mean, because I've seen, if not more, but I've seen a substantial number of people who are anti-abortion on the Democratic side too.
Yeah, but I think that's it's been a winning, reproductive rights has been a winning issue for the Democrats in the last couple of election cycles. For one thing, it really energizes their base and gets people out. They want to make sure that those rights are protected. And for another thing, they've been much more expansive in terms of how they look at abortion rights. And now we have these laws or these referenda, these policies that are popping up in states. We just saw it in Arizona, where they're going to put something on the ballot that, if it's passed in November, would protect those rights. Those are the kinds of agenda items, those are the kinds of laws and efforts that will really bring out voters, women voters, whether they be Democrats or Republicans.
This is an issue, sorry, Greg, that was a winner for Democrats in states like Kansas and Kentucky. And so I think that, just like Laura said, Democrats very rightly realize that at this moment in this political climate, it makes policy and politics sense for them to lean in on it, and I think we're going to hear a lot about it next week.
And she'll be talking about that. It's implicit in her message of "we will not go back," which is part of the argument that she's trying to make. And on those levels, I'm surprised that the Harris campaign and Democrats aren't making a bigger deal out of the Supreme Court as it relates to gay marriage rights and to LGBTQ rights, which the Supreme Court has been clear they're going after. Thomas and Alito have been pretty clear about we have an issue with these past rulings, and young people in particular are very against that. They're very against going after that. So I think a lot of these social issues are winners for the Democrats if they go after them, and some of them they're not quite talking about, but they probably should.
You're seeing Walz talk a lot about it, using kind of, down-home language like, get them out of our, they shouldn't
your own
be,
damn
mind your own
business.
mind your own damn business. So that goes to those issues, I think.
Yeah, I guess Democrats have learned to frame the argument as it's not about being pro-abortion. No one is pro-abortion. Some people, it's about freedom to choose, and so the choice is the word that.
And Trump has struggled, I think, to what is Trump's exact position on the abortion issue? I'm not totally sure.
His position is, I have no position. I don't want to talk about it
I don't
anymore.
wanna
Leave it up
talk
to
Depends on what
Right.
day you get.
Well,
I
he-
think that's true.
Yeah, even though it has changed, he is now saying, I have always been against abortion, but I have always been for the exceptions of,
Yeah.
and then gone down the list, which actually he wasn't always. But that's.
He also wants to leave it to the states. That's his position. Even though at the same time he also brags about how he put together a Supreme Court that struck down Roe v. Wade. He's very proud of that, but at the same time, he doesn't want there would be a federal jurisdiction on abortion. It should go to the states. So it's a lot of contradictions there.
A couple of mechanical issues in terms of the actual campaign itself, and we might be able to dispense with this one quickly. The role of vice presidential candidates. There are some people who think the only thing a vice presidential candidate can do is hurt the person at the top of the ticket. How do we feel about how this is playing out on both sides of the aisle? Quinn Myers?
I think that if you look at the past 3 weeks, it's been a huge boon for not a huge win, but definitely a success for Kamala Harris. Tim Walz has been out there. He's got that folksy Midwestern attitude that I think they believe can help them win Michigan, Wisconsin, maybe Pennsylvania. J.D. Vance has had a series of bad headlines. I don't know if the vetting was fully done or they just didn't care, but the childless cat women comment, I think the labeling of him as, quote, weird has been pretty effective. Whether it will matter in the long run, though, I'm not so sure. I do think people really don't give much respect to vice presidential candidates. They don't see them as being in the room where the decisions are being made, probably because they're often not in that room, especially historically. I think that's been the case, and that's what the entire show Veep is really about, is her trying to get in the room, and literally you never even see the president once in that show. So I do think it matters. It does help energize the base, but I don't know if it will move the needle on election day.
But on Veep, just like in real life 4 years ago, we were saying the same thing. It doesn't really matter who Joe Biden picks, but now it matters because you never know what's going to happen.
And isn't that the one thing that people are now realizing? I mean, this is, one of those few times in our history where the vice president is in some ways about to step up.
Yeah, and the experience though shows like Sarah Palin was a drain on the McCain ticket.
Dan Quayle.
Dan Quayle, Vance is when it comes to like who has children, stuff like that, that's extremely personal, and talking about the childless cat ladies and how they don't have real lives that matter is devastating, and so.
Yes, we now have childless cat ladies for, I'm serious, there is a childless cat ladies
For
Harris group.
Well, the other issue is that Vance has talked about, although he denies this, but it's on tape, that that people who don't have children don't have as many voting rights. They shouldn't have as much of an option or as much participation
don't
in
have
the
a
voting.
stake in the
They don't
country
stake,
success as
which
much.
you're offending a very large number of voters
Yes.
there. And that's never a good idea. I think he's a drag on the ticket, Vance. I think, if it's close enough, it could have made a difference. But I think I would have subscribed to what you alluded to earlier, Craig, is the do no harm factor is the most important thing you want to look at when you choose a vice presidential
Which
candidate.
is why he's been so quiet lately.
And Trump does seem to be maybe almost regretting J.D. Vance. There have been a couple comments where reporters asked, Democrats are characterizing you as weird. And he said, not me, that's J.D. They're calling weird.
One other thing, and let's face it, this was the issue in the last election, or the election that Trump won. Swing states, key battlegrounds. It's not about the popular vote. It's not how many votes. It's which states, and are the Republicans still better at playing that game than the Democrats?
Well, not according to the most recent polls. I mean, there's basically, you could argue about one or two of them, but basically maybe 7 swing states that really matter and are going to really decide the election. And some of the polls recently in the last week or so, at least in several of those states, have Kamala Harris inching ahead. And, when 3 weeks ago, Joe Biden was way behind. So those are you're right, those are the places we need to really be watching as we go forward.
The Electoral College is DEI for red states. It is structurally an advantage that they have. It's not necessarily that they're better. It's just the way it's shaped up. We've had Democrats have won 8 of the last 9 popular votes and lost the White House a couple times when they won. It's they have a real advantage there, being the Republican Party.
It's also why the 2 major issues that we've heard about so far are, 2 of them are fracking and whether tips get taxed. I mean, these are things that are extremely local to just a handful of areas that I think is ultimately bad for democracy, probably, if so much of the campaigning is just targeted to these very narrow, flippable groups.
I'm curious to see how local politicians sell these candidates in these swing states. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, 4 of possibly the biggest swing states, all have Democratic governors. Can they help deliver? Does that even make a difference here? There was a lot of talk about getting Shapiro on the ticket to Pennsylvania governor to try to help sway Pennsylvania for Kamala Harris's favor. I'm curious to see if that would have made a difference here. So I really, I think we're unfortunately for the rest of the country watching about 5, 6 states here.
What does Donald Trump have to do in order to win, and what does Kamala Harris have to do to win?
For Trump, it cannot be about Trump. It has to be about they did a bad job, and here's what I care about these issues. It can't be about 4 years of a guy yelling on Truth Social and Twitter and insulting everybody in the world. He should really tone that down and just run a. If he was running the campaign that they were trying to get him to run, the unity campaign after the assassination attempt, he could probably even beat Harris pretty easily. You know, it just focus on the issues. But if it's a referendum on his attributes, it's going to be a problem.
And for Harris, I agree completely. For Harris, she's got to run a campaign that's about the future and not about the past, and not fall into this trap of having to take responsibility for the Biden administration's mistakes, even though many people feel that Biden didn't do a bad job as president. She's got to be forward-looking. Her policies have got to be forward-looking. She's got to really generate a lot of enthusiasm, particularly among younger voters, among voters of color. Those are the people who are really going to come to the fore for her, and just be looking forward.
Alex?
Yeah, I agree. I think that because especially in today's political world, so much of the electorate seems so locked in, and there's an increasingly narrow, I think, persuadable sector of the electorate that might be able to be won over. But that's also why Kamala Harris has such a unique opportunity right now. And I think in a lot of this polling, it's not like people's perceptions of Trump are really changing that much. It's that you have this opportunity for this new candidate. And I agree with Laura, this is really the opportunity for her to roll out some of those, actual clear forward-looking agenda items and say, here's what I'm going to deliver to voters.
Shia?
Yes, I think Trump needs to stay on message. That's his. When he starts deviating, being interviewed by Elon Musk, I mean, that seems to be a problem. He needs to stay on message, and she needs to talk to people who might be independent and who might be on the bubble of some sort to win them back or win them over.
I'm curious if she can get away with not truly defining herself in the next 90 days. She is in many ways lucky. I don't mean she hasn't worked hard to get here, but she doesn't have the baggage of a 2-year campaign, and she can kind of skate off of the momentum and the anti-Trump sentiment. So can she get away without sticking to very specific policies and then just hope that people think she's good enough? So and get that vote. Will that take place?
That word hope reminded us. Let's face, how did Barack Obama get? He was a new face, and I don't know that he even defined himself as minutely as.
No, and he could get into it. I decided to punish myself recently and watch the video of him talking to Joe the plumber from 2008, and they were talking about substantive, narrow tax policy. Like they were talking about some substantive issues there. But we don't really remember that. We don't really remember what was his position on a public option or whatever. We remember it was about hope. It was about change. And Harris doesn't necessarily have to, have the signature, we're going to lower or eliminate ATM fees as her benchmark.
That's a winner.
She needs to be there as she needs to define the race as forward looking.
The challenge too, sorry to keep
No, go
interrupting. I've listened to some of those old Obama speeches, and they are really long and really in the weeds.
It's very wonky.
And you
Yes.
can't be that way anymore. It's funny how the media has changed over the past, 8 or 10 years, where you have to be sharper and to the point, and that's where Trump gets in
that's
trouble.
yeah.
And
that's
you know,
our fault
here's-
too, somewhat.
yeah.
That we our audiences don't demand that we get into details, and we don't pursue it, I think, sometimes.
Well, it's demands of digital media. It's the TikToks of the world and the Instagrams of the world. Everything has to be reduced to these little bite-sized chunks of information, video, and that's what we have to produce to stay alive in the media. But to Shia's point, you can't get into anything complex or wonky or substantive when you're doing.
People just turn the
right.
page.
Yeah, and sometimes you just want to shake the audience and go, no, but listen, these two, they're different. You got to listen to what they have to say.
You really have to pay attention to these ATM fees.
Yeah, well, there's that. Okay, well, that is a winner. But the last thing I want to talk about is the legacy of Joe Biden. And I'm going to start with you, Quinn. I mean, how will Joe Biden's presidency be remembered?
Well, I think he would like to be remembered by all of his, supposedly great policies, and I think some of them will be remembered. But the defining act of his presidency was choosing not to run for re-election, I believe, and that's how he will be remembered. That will be probably in the first line or two of his obituary, that he, facing incredible pressure from his party and otherwise, decided not to run for re-election. I do think that will be a defining moment of his entire career.
Shia?
I think hopefully the second or third graph will be how he brought normalcy back to government and the White House after a very tumultuous 4 years, not just because of Donald Trump in the White House, but because of COVID and everything that the country was going through. He really kind of, brought people back, I think.
I think that that's all true. I think that in addition, what folks probably should remember him for better or worse, is that he was legislatively probably accomplished more in one term than arguably either of his two predecessors did. Well, his direct predecessor had one term too, but a lot of really significant legislation, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, and especially the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that those in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act, we are going to be seeing for years and decades how those infrastructure and climate investments are going to be embedding themselves and playing out in the fight against climate change and how our country is built.
Well, back to our conversation about why do vice presidents matter. He was a vice president, and he was also a long-time, very successful senator and congressman. And I think that is at the root of the success that he had legislatively. And that's an example of maybe why you want someone like that in the White House, because especially in a difficult time when there's so many divides. But Quentin, to your point about his legacy being that he stepped down, I think it will only be a positive legacy if Kamala Harris wins the White House, because, if she was the White House, that he could be credited with saving the Democratic Party and saving the country from Trump, if you believe that was.
Otherwise, he's Lyndon Johnson.
Otherwise, he's Lyndon Johnson. Yes.
But maybe then he could at least come back and he won't publicly, but say, "Well, I told you I could beat Trump. I would have beaten Trump."
Yeah, right.
Former President Trump spent 2 months attempting to overthrow the last presidential election after he lost the race. And President Biden beat him in the election, had a period of somewhat normalcy. I mean, we'll see what happens with Ukraine. We'll see what happens with this. But this is the guy who defeated the guy who attempted to overthrow the election. If Harris wins, that is what he will be remembered for, is defeating Trump and then turning it over. If he loses, it's really interesting to see what will Trump do for those next 4 years, because we will not, people, let's say Trump loses, people will not be talking about his tax policies in 50 years or 100 years. They will be talking about the guy who attempted to overthrow the election. And so it all depends on whether or not Harris wins, but otherwise he is the guy who won the election against the guy who tried to overthrow it and then who turned it over.
Well, I'm going to thank all 5 of you for joining me for this. Laura Washington, Gregory Pratt, Alex Nitkin, Quinn Myers, and Shia Kapos. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for
It was
having
fun.
us.